Hello everyone. Today we will present about new historicism and cultural criticism. These two theories are overlapping because they both have so much in common, but we will discuss it separately. And this is our group member. Okay, now we start with historicism. There are actually two ways. The first one is traditional and then the new one. What makes them different? Okay, I will explain the traditional one first. Traditional historians see that the history is a series of events that have a linear causal relationship. So it's like after event A, we have event B, and then event C, and so on. If you look for the example, we have this to make it easier. I have an example like the history of Indonesia's proclamation. So the first one is America bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then Rengas Dengklok happened, and then the proclaimed happened. Basically, it's like the history lessons that we've learned in school. They also believe that we can uncover the facts of those history events through objective analysis. So all the history we knew is a fact from the historical items. And with those facts, we can see and know the culture from that era. We see it through the history events. They also believe that history is progressive, meaning human is improving over the course of time in its moral, cultural, and technological accomplishments. Okay, that's for the traditional one, and now we're moving to the new historicism. New historicism believes that history events we know is just an interpretation, not a fact. Why? We may know the events well because of the historical items, but we don't know about the complex web of competing ideologies and conflicting social, political, and cultural in that time and that place. So we can say that there is the impossibility of objective analysis. We're not sure what is right or wrong, what is civilized and uncivilized, and what is important and what is not during that era, that history era. That's why the historians who don't live at that time, that history, their views of history events are not so objective because they don't really know the culture back then. New historicism also believes that history is very complex. It is not just a linear like the traditional one, so it's probably like this. Yeah, so there are a lot of factors. One of them is probably culture that may trigger or influence the history events. So if you see this picture, it's like K influence A, Q influence F and B, and then F influence B, probably G triggers the C, and so on. It is very complex. I quote this from the book. It's more like an improvised dance consisting of an infinite variety of steps, following any new route at any given moment and having no particular goal or destination. So that is what the history looks like according to the new historicism. It is very complex. From that, we know that history are shaped by culture and shape the culture in which they can emerge. We also have to pay attention to our subjectivity in seeing history. The subjectivity is some aspects like political, educational, ideologies, and religious aspect. So that aspect can create, promote, or change people. This subjectivity happens in a lifelong process. It's also influenced the history events we talked earlier, like the complex graphs that I made like 2 slides ago. And what aspect is the most influencing? It is power. So Michel Foucault says that power circulates in all directions, to and from all social levels at all times. From that, we also know that power doesn't emanate only from the top of the political and socio-economical structure, or we basically can say the high rank. The low class or low ranks, like common people, also has the power too. Thus, they can also influence the history events. Basically, all people can influence the history events. But how? How can we influence the history? We are just common people. Like we have what we called a discourse. Discourse is a social language that happened in a particular time and place because of particular condition. It expresses a particular way of understanding human experience. So all the lessons we've learned in the subjects are an example of discourse, like Marxist criticism, feminist criticism, and many other one. Those lessons, those discourses also overlap and compete each other, and this what makes the power I've mentioned can circulate. We are exchanging ideas and negotiating power indirectly. That's the discourse. The word discourse draws attention to the role of language as the vehicle of ideology, says the book. But we have to be careful because the discourses themselves cannot explain the dynamic of social power, because there are no totalizing explanation of history, so be careful. And okay, the next one, from that perspective, we know that the word normal, right, and natural, it depends on our own definition based on the discourses we know. Different cultures in one era also influenced definitions. For example, like homosexual once was an abnormal thing, but later changed to normal and then natural. It depends on the culture, where do we live and when do we live. So we in Indonesia will say homosexual is not normal or not natural because we live in Indonesia and we are ingrained with our culture that homosexual is not right. So that is the subjectivity. We have to consider it in seeing the history. So the conclusion is historical analysis cannot be seen in only a linear way, cannot be objective, and cannot decide the culture and history directly without the subjectivity consideration. Okay, that's all for me.
Okay, the next material will present by me. I will continue Ricky material about new historical and cultural criticism. The first one is new historicism deconstructs the traditional opposition between history and literature. In this context, traditionally thought as a factual and literature thought as a fictional. And new historicism considers history a text that can be interpreted the same way literary critics interpret literary texts. And new historicism, as we know, history only in its textual form, like documents and then diary. That is, even when historians base base their findings on the kinds of primary sources, those primary sources are almost always in the form of some sort of writing. And let me take an example. Historical documents can be studied in terms of their rhetorical strategies, and they can be deconstructed to reveal the limitation of their own ideological assumptions, something like that. And new historicists consider both primary and secondary sources of historical information forms of narrative. Both of secondary sources and primary sources is tell some kind of story, I think, and therefore those stories can be analyzed using the tools of literary criticism. And new historicism has deconstructed the white, male, and black people, the experiences of those people it has oppressed in order to maintain the dominance that allowed it to control what most Americans know about history itself. And then, before we talk about the master narrative, in fact, right now, focus on the historical narratives of marginalized people has been such an important feature of new historicism that some theorists have asked how new historians can accept narrative from other peoples. Like, historical narrative from all groups help ensure that master narrative itself in this context means that a narrative told from a single cultural point of view and presumes to offer the only accurate version of history, like will no longer control our historical understanding. I think at this point in time we still do not have an accurate representation of historical narrative from all groups, like, and even as the historical narratives of some groups are, I think, becoming more and more numerous, like, yeah. And then the next one is history is a text that is interpreted by different cultures to fit, sorry for the typo, the ideological needs of their own power structures. which is a new historical concerns. In this context, I mean like new historicism might be defined as the history of stories cultures tell themselves about themselves, or as a corrective to some traditional historical accounts. And at this moment, there is no history in the traditional sense of term. There are only the representation of history. Like when we want to learn about history, there is no actual story, the original story, or we don't even know the truth of the history itself. And the next one is to focus on marginalized historical narratives. New historical analysis involves what is called a thick description. In this context, thick descriptions attempts like through close and then detailed examination of given cultural production and to discover the meanings of that particular cultural production had for the people in whose community it occurred, and to reveal the social conventions and many more. And also, I think thick description in this moment is not a search for fact, but a search for meanings. And then, indeed, because our traditional historicism, I think, tended to ignore or marginalize private life as subjective and irrelevant. And New Historicism claimed that historical analysis is like what unavoidably subjective, is not an attempt to legitimize a self-indulgent attitude towards the writing of history. I think that's enough from me. But before we go to the next presenters, I would like to talk a little bit about the key concept. The first one is the writing of history. History is a matter of interpretations, not facts. All historical accounts are narrative and can be analyzed using many of the tools used by literary critics to analyze the narrative itself. And the second one is history is neither linear nor progressive. Linear in this context, I mean like it does not proceed neatly from case A to the B or from B to the C. Nor progressive. Progressive in this context means that the human species is not steadily improving over the course of time. The third one is power is never wholly confined to the single person or a single level of society. Like rather, power circulates in a culture through exchanges of material goods and exchanges of ideas through the various discourses, cultural processes. And the fourth one is there is no monolithic spirit of an age and there is no adequate totalizing explanation of history. I think in this context it means that there is only a dynamic, like unstable interplay among discourses, and so the analysis will always be incomplete, accounting for only a part of the historical picture. Like I mean, the meaning of which the historian can try to analyze, and from this analyze will always be incomplete, something like that. And the fifth one is personal identity. Like historical events, texts, and artifacts is shaped by and shapes the culture in which it emerges. Like cultural categories such as normal and abnormal, sane and insane, and many more. And then last but not least is all historical analysis is unavoidably subjective. Historians must therefore, I think, reveal the ways in which they know they have been positioned by their own cultural experience to interpret their own history, like the real history of itself. I think that's enough for my presentation. Thank you guys. So let's go and let's move to.
Okay, back to me again, Ricky. And now I will discuss about new historicism and the literature. We will talk about some history in here. Okay, so the first one, in 19th century and early 20th century, new historical criticism confined itself largely to the studies of the author's life, in order to discover his or her intention in writing the work or to studies of the historical period in which the work was written. We can also find the culture in that era. But for historians, literature is purely a subjective item, unlike history which is considered as a fact. So, literature could never be interpreted to mean anything that history didn't authorize it to mean. Okay, so we'll discuss some history, how new historical and literature related. It started from 1940s to the 1960s. New criticisms that we've learned before controls the literary studies. New criticism said that the understanding of a literary text's meaning has nothing to do with history because literary works are timeless, autonomous, and it is the art objects that exist in a realm beyond history. Next one. In 1970s, New Historicism emerged and it rejects both traditional historicism and new criticism. So the first point is that literary works don't embody the author's intention or illustrate the spirit of the age that produced it. It is like the traditional literary historian said. And the second one, literary works are not art objects that transcend the time and place, and it is like the new criticism said. Instead, new historicism believe that literary texts are cultural artifacts that can tell us something about the interplay of discourses, the web of social meanings operating in time and place in which the text was written. It is because literary text is also a part of interplay of discourses that makes the history complex. Like the one that I have mentioned before in my previous PowerPoint with my graph. The history is complex because of this. Literary text is also a part of interplay of discourses. Okay, so now what is the difference? If you want to see the example of how the new historical readings and traditional historical readings is different, you can read the material in page 292. Because I will not explain it here, I will just go for the conclusions. So, from those literal examples in the book, we can know that traditional historical criticism sees that history is an objective reality that can be known and against which the subjective literary work is interpreted. In the contrast, new historical focuses on how the literary text itself functions as a historical discourse interacting with other historical discourses. So, new historical is concerned not with historical events as events, but with the ways in which events are interpreted with historical discourses, with ways of seeing the world and modes of meaning. We can really know exactly what happened at any given point in history, but we can know what the people involved believed happened. We can know from their own accounts the various ways in which they interpreted their experience, and we can interpret those interpretations. So, it's like the conclusion, New Historicism sees that the literary text, through its representation of human experience at given time and place, is an interpretation of history. So, literary text is an interpretation of history based on New Historicism. Because the literary text was shaped by the discourses circulating in the culture in which it was produced. It's just the same like us right now. Our interpretation of literature are shaped by the culture in which we live right now. Okay, so that's all for me, and we go for the next one. Thank you.
Okay, so now let's move on. I'm Sela, and I'm gonna be the one who present about cultural criticism. What is cultural criticism? Cultural criticism is another critical lens through which any text can be viewed. This form of criticism examines how different religions, ethnicities, class identifications, political beliefs, and views affect the ways in which texts are created and interpreted. For cultural critics, culture is a process, not a product. It is a lived experience, not a fixed definition. More precisely, a culture is a collection of interactive cultures, which is growing, changing, and constituted at any given moment in the time by the intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, occupation, and similar factors that contribute to the experience of the members. Cultural criticism and new historicism have more similarities, beliefs than differences. The first one, both beliefs that human history and culture constitute a complex arena of dynamic forces, of which we can construct only a partial subjective pictures. The next one, both also argue that human experience, which is the stuff of human history and culture, cannot be adequately understood by the means of academic disciplines. And cultural criticism can also cause misinterpretations for beginners in the way of some terms. It refers to any kinds of analysis of any aspects of culture. For example, the reading of The Great Gatsby offered some criticism in it. Marxist criticism, feminist criticism, lesbian gay criticism, and post-colonial African-American criticism could all be considered examples of cultural criticism. In the broadest sense, because all of these interpretations use the novel to explore some aspects of American culture. This one will be later explained by Keisha and Ivan. Cultural criticism is well related to Marxism, which divided society into working class and dominant class. The criticism believed that the dominant class defined high and low culture in order to strengthen its own its own power and superiority. The dominant class determines what art forms are considered high and low. The high ones, such as ballet, opera, and other fine arts, and the low culture, usually in the form of television sitcoms, popular music, and pulp fictions. Not yet. However, cultural critics argue that low-class population produce art forms that not only change their own experience but also influence the whole culture. For cultural critics, however, there is no meaningful distinction between high and low forms of culture. For all cultures, production usually express the cultural work they do. It's the way they shape the experiences by transmitting or transforming their ideology, which means, of course, the role of cultural productions in circulations of power. Okay, so now let's move on to cultural criticism and literature. Literature plays an important role in cultural criticism. Literary texts and some other cultural productions will reach members of certain cultural groups to experience cultural experiences. The following questions can help us to begin examining the kinds of cultural work performed by a literary text. The first one is, what kinds of behavior, what models of practice does this work seem to enforce? And then the next one, why might the readers at a particular time and place find this work compelling? Are there differences between my values and the values implicit in the work I am reading? Upon what social understandings does the work depend? Whose freedom of thought or movement might be constrained implicitly or explicitly by this work? What are the larger social structures with which these particular acts of praise or blame, that is the text's apparent technical orientation, might be connected? So, these questions you see on the screen helps us to make connections between the literary text and the culture in which it emerged or interpreted. So whether examining popular culture high or both, cultural critics try to map the changing of ideological functions that are given cultural productions performs at the hands of those who respond to it. To sum up, cultural criticism tends to be more overtly political in its support oppressed group. Because of political orientations, cultural criticism often draws on Marxist, feminist, and other political theories in performing analysis. Cultural criticism, in the narrower sense of terms, is especially interested in popular cultures. However, it is important to remember that even analyzing cultural criticism operations do not view oppressed as politicals. Theory sometimes does so as helpless victims, but like the new historicism, cultural criticism views oppressed people as victims of dominant forces structures and able to reject or change the power structures. So that's all for me. Let's move on to another presenters.
Okay, so I'm Kezia Angelina Grisela and I will continue to the next part, which is The Great Gatsby. Okay, so F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, 1925, was published during of America's greatest periods of economic growth, as the nation expanded its border and developed its industries between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the stock market crashed in 1929. Many private fortunes were made. Okay, so there is a statement that the success stories of millionaires majorities came from an uneducated and unsuccessful farmer. Is that true? Everyone in America knew the success story of millionaires like John D. Rockefeller, Jay Gould, Jim Face, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Philip M. Moore, and James G. Hill. Even Gatsby's father is an uneducated and unsuccessful farmer, is aware of the stories. He says of his son, if he'd of lived, he'd do of been a great man. The dominant discourse of the period was a discourse of the self-made man, which circulated in the success manuals of the period in the self-improvement. Speeches and essays composed by the self-made millionaires of that era. In the Horatio Alger novel, in the McGuffey Readers, which were used throughout the nation to teach young children to read, and in the biographies of famous self-made men. Gatsby lived in 1890 up to 1922, roughly the same historical period from which the novel emerged, for Fitzgerald was born in 1896 and The Great Gatsby was published in 1925. The books that explain how poor boys could rise to heights of the great wealth, called Success Manuals for Rich. In Austin Bierpower, How to Be Succeed, in 1900, a representative example of the genre. The following advice is given to the prospective self-made man: work hard, have a clear purpose, be prepared for opportunity, don't procrastinate, preserve, keep in a good physical condition, and avoid drink. J. Gatsby itself fits this profile in a number of ways. Therefore, he was born to poor farm people and spent his youth in rural Minnesota. His boyhood of General Rizzo found in his copy of Hapolanga CD just below his Franklinski daily schedule of activities reads like a mini success manual. The first one, no wasting time at Shafter, or a name of incredible. No more smoking or chewing. Bath every other day. Read on improving book or magazine per week. Save $5 or $3 per week. Be better to parents. Other texts that circulated the discourse of the self-made man were the novels of Horatio Alger, which were immensely popular during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the most pervasive vehicle for the ideology of the self-made man were the McGuffey Readers, a series of elementary school books used to teach reading, which were a dominant force in American education from the mid-19th century to early 1920s. The stories and poems contained in the Reader Excel the same virtues promoted by the success manual of the period: honesty, hard work, kindness, and the avoidance of alcohol and bad company. In addition, like the success manual, Horatio Alger novels, and other texts that circulate the discourse of the self-made man, the readers illustrated the belief that the success is the product of a good character. For example, a poor boy receives a job because the old man he has kindly helped cross the street turns out to own his own business. Or an orphan boy is adopted by a wealthy man because he has resisted the temptation to steal the man's gold watch, or etc. Thank you. That's all from me, and the next part will be explained by Ivan.
Hello, this is Ivan Tadjusaristya, and I'm gonna explain about the part 2 of the Great Gatsby. And yes, how is this begin? And the Great Gatsby novel has clearly claimed that most of the novel was written by the self-made man that include the American cultures in it, since the texts are taken by that culture that was used in the 18th, 19th century until early 20th century. The novel itself has a comment which contains about the relationship about the discourse of the history of America itself. And yeah, the discourse also self-made the claim of the open annals for the American history of itself, since it mostly for the people who has ambition and perseverance. And the contradiction itself has also appeared in the many autobiographical stories as a self-made man who is mostly for the millionaires, and they always spoke about their realities when they are young. In general population, sorry, in many generations, the millionaires are grow is by the generation to the future of the generation itself. And most of the millionaires didn't like to do a charity and to do the philanthropy of the endowed libraries, museum, and university, especially in the one example is Andrew Carnegie, who was having a happy family, even if he as a poor immigrant child. And we can observe that Andrew Carnegie has decent family economies, and you can see how he also trained to engage some kind of debate later on in the future. Carnegie also observed himself that he was richly compensated. He also observed his poverty and also be compensated by the support of the training that he received from the bosom of the strong family. And since he was so rich and so strong, he realized that he didn't know anything about around of his neighborhood, including the other teenager that is really poor and the age is almost same as he is. So most of the time, the one if you have anything that is money, a house, or anything, you didn't realize anything about the community itself, especially in your own neighborhood too. And then in the Greek Gatsby novel, the history inside of it also claimed that based on the Gatsby as fought by himself and also from his own origins. It started when his parents were not accept him as their child, since both of his parents were broke and they unsuccessful and they syphilis that make them as a just a regular people. Gatsby did not happy about that, and so on. He tried to create a family that makes him happy than his own parents back then. And then he also claimed himself about the statement that came from Daisy and Tom, which called it was just personal. This kind of statement was really confusing for other people, including Nick. I think Nick is one of the Gatsby friends, and it is really confusing, but sometimes it makes sense on the real life. And also the discourse also we call it the errors of the history. When the mostly they choose to ignore or marginalizing about the enormous character in many self-famous made men. Also, their advice from their honesty, it just came from their honesty and integrity in the workplace, uh, to frugality and sobriety in the home. Because they believe about the success was came from within the man self. The interesting about the Greek Gatsby novel, and there is some context about when he published the novel. It has a critical response since his novel title was completely taken from the American culture, and also he using idealizing about ignoring and marginalizing that can be fulfill his own desire. So Greek Gatsby always publicate his novel, but he get some critics from someone about the title itself. The connection between a self-made man also interest in his story can be seen in the McCarthy reader for itself. That's contain the material of the reader itself as striking the absence of the reference to their historical reality. And the history was also transcend in the McCarthy readers. It also has sentimentalization of experience. That means some sentimental description about the based from the injured animals or failed to see children report their unselfishness for some everyday windfall, and then so on, like the peaceful death of the angelic children and the heroic deeds. That's kind of weird, but yeah, in their own era, they believe kind of those things. And then Gatsby autobiographical is more like the outline of the stage Victorian melodrama, sorry, than a narrative about the actual life itself. It's about his cats, by the way. And also, the actor named Robert Redford confirmed to play as J. Gatsby, who played in the 1974 novel that came, sorry, the movie that related to the 1974 novel called Fitzgerald, that told about the Gatsby as a American popular imagination. Yes, that's all for my explanation about the Great Gatsby with the historical and culturalism. Thank you for watching and see you later.